Well, we're looking at this powerful message that's coming to us from Samuel as we enter into the second week of Ordinary Time. And this is a powerful time. We understand that. It's that ordinary time that exists between now and Lent. And it's leading us through the entire year, now that we finished Advent and Christmas, of what our theme will be. And of course, you know, I focus on the first reading. And so we're continuing what we started last week in the first week of Ordinary Time. Year 2, remember, year 1 is different. The first week of Ordinary Time, we're looking at that whole understanding of Samuel. And I told you, Samuel is loaded with a lot. Now, come to find out, in the older books, in the Douay-Rheims, and you know, one of the reasons why I use the Douay-Rheims more is because I can read from the Douay-Rheims without worrying about copyright issues. I know it sounds silly, but it is real. So I can read from the Douay-Rheims without worrying about copyright issues. And 1 Samuel in the Douay-Rheims is actually 1 Kings. So just so you know. But here what we're looking at is something really powerful. It's a powerful principle that it's important to understand. And that principle you're going to find over and over again from the prophets. The Lord wants obedience more than sacrifice. He wants both, but he wants obedience more than sacrifice. Why did Jesus put himself on the cross? Because he was obedient to the Father. Of that whole reality, which was the most important? His obedience. Why? Because it was disobedience that brought down humanity by the disobedience of Adam and Eve. That's why. So why was it so important? What was Mary's action that was so important? Obedience to the Father through Gabriel, the angel Gabriel. So we're going to see in the Old Testament over and over again, obedience is more important than sacrifice. And Jesus fights over this all the time with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are focused on everything being done right. They do their prayers at the right time. As Jesus complains that they fill their phylacteries. They do their prayers at the right time. They follow the law, but they use the law for their own advantage. So they are actually disobedient to the Father, but it looks like that they are actually obedient. And so they're doing their sacrifices, but they're not being obedient. And this is something the Lord despises. Now, one of the issues here is that they are fighting against Amalek. And as I did my research, we find that Amalek, well, you got to look at it this way, and this is one of the things that I understood here, and I can see this in the Israel Bible, the IsraelBible.com. Okay, and I looked up the question, what makes Amalek so evil? So the issue, according to them. Let me see if I have an author here. The Israel Bible team. The issue, according to them, is, you know, when the Exodus happened, and the rest of the world saw this. As a matter of fact, we looked at last week. They went, "Oh wow, be careful. This is Israel, and Israel did these awful." Israel's God did these awful plagues against the Egyptians, and that's who we're fighting. Well, the rest of the world was in awe of the God of Israel. But do keep in mind, the gods of the Jews, the God of Israel at this time, is key. He's the only one who is the one God. All the other gods, all the other nations, they had many gods, but their gods are nationalistic. The Babylonians worship their own set of gods. The Egyptians worship their own set of gods. All the way down the line. So even though they both may worship the sun god, they have their own a concept of who the sun god is. So we see that. And this is one of the important messages of Genesis. The important message of Genesis is there is no sun god because God created all things. That's an important message. But they're all nationalistic. Now, according to the Israel Bible, the reason why Amalek was so evil is they didn't care. They said, we despise the God of Israel and we are going to destroy his people. And that's why there was no working with them at all. They would just actually hated Israel consistently. So God commands Saul to eliminate Amalek. But God has certain rules on how to do that. And one of them is when he calls for a ban on people, I understood from my research, that means destroy everything. Now, I know that in our concept today, that sounds pretty awful, but that's what they believe in. That's what God taught, destroy everything. But what did Saul do? He took the animals, which he wasn't supposed to do, and he brought them for sacrifice. Now, but the sacrifice wasn't done right, and it wasn't done by the right people. And so what's reflected here is Saul is being disobedient. But what's the most important thing? Obedience. Obedience is more important than sacrifice. The person who is obedient to the Lord, but is not respecting what the Lord calls him to do, is not doing the will of the Lord. So I can give you an interesting example. I told a story in my homily. I told a story in my homily on Sunday, which you may have heard. Well, actually, you wouldn't have heard it unless you were at Mass, so I'm sorry. I just happened to look out the window and said, uh-oh, it's snowing. So, and anyway, I told a story, and the story was that one of the things that we understand is we're called to love others. And I told the story of allowing a homeless person to sleep on our porch when I was in Lowell, Massachusetts, on the rectory porch. The rectory porch was huge, and it was open. There was a roof over it, but other than that, it was open. And no one used it. So there was this guy was homeless, and he needed a place to stay, and people would just, get out of here, get out of here. And I said, go to sleep on the porch. I don't care. And people would come to me all the time and go, do you know you have a homeless person sleeping on the porch? You know every homeless person sleeping on the porch? Yes, I do. Do you know every homeless, it'd be raining out. Just stay on the porch. Don't worry about it. And I did that out of what God calls us to do. When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was, all that. So I did that. I said, look, there's no one here. Just sleep on the porch. Feel free. Someone came up to me afterwards and said, in the city where I am, in Brockton, there was an ordinance that was passed last year that the homeless cannot sleep outside at night. Okay, well, in the winter, that makes sense. But what about the summer? And no, so I cannot manifest. So if I was living in a rectory, which I'm not, I'm living in an apartment. But if I was living in a rectory at the time and I had a big porch and I said, go sleep. It may be a problem. Well, it's interesting to look at that because, granted, the homeless issue is a problem, and the homeless issue is a problem a lot with economy and a lot with misunderstanding the homeless issue and a lot with all of the issues that happen. There's a lot of issues with homelessness. So this is one of the aspects that happen. But what is the Lord calling me to do? And how am I supposed to do that? Now, if I am faithful at Mass and do everything at Mass and say to some homeless, like, get the heck out of here, you lazy bum, I'm not being obedient. I'm doing sacrifice correctly, but I'm not obedient to the Father. And you see what that is. And that God hates. Well, in this case, what is happening is God is called for the total destruction of Amalek. Okay, whether we agree with that or not, this is what the story has. The total destruction of Amalek, because they want the total destruction of Israel and their God. Okay, so this is what's happening, God says. And Saul does not follow the instruction. He does sacrifice, but he didn't do it correctly. And one of the things that's brought up from the Israel Bible is the idea that what Saul is doing is he's bowing to the will of the people, which is what the Lord demands he does not do. He must bow to the will of God. And so what happens is God says, that's it, I'm done. And he literally fires Saul, not on the spot, but we're going to see that. But he literally fires Saul. So this is what happens. This is one of the issues, and it's this major theme in the Old Testament, and that is be obedient to the Lord. And what he doesn't want, and this is probably one of the reasons, is he doesn't want a king that's going to be obedient to the people and not to God. Now, this brings up an interesting question for us. Maybe we can reflect more on it in the second half. And that is, what about democracy? Oh, wait. What is democracy? Democracy is getting the leadership to follow the will of the people. Now, I believe in democracy and everything else, but that means the people have a responsibility as well. And if they don't have a responsibility to understand that their role is to bring the message, is to live in obedience to God in all things, and therefore they shouldn't seek after their own interests. They should seek after God's interests, which is the common good. Then you have a problem. And this is one of the issues we deal with democracies. It's not that I'm disagreeing with democracy, but the people have to have the right motive as well. This is one of the reasons why Alexis de Tocqueville said that the churches were an important part of the American democracy. And if you don't, he says, if you get rid of the churches, the whole thing will collapse. Why? Because you're going to fall into a tyranny, is what he said. What he said is you'd have a tyranny of the majority. Although what we're seeing here is a tyranny of the minority. And of course, Alexis de Tocqueville existed before the media was so strong. And I'm coming from the teachings of Noam Chomsky. What did Noam Chomsky teach? He taught from the 60s. He taught that the media is there to get the people to come to a consensus that the government likes. Basically, that's what he taught, and that's what the media does. So if you're going to live in a democracy and you're going to be faithful to the Lord, then you have to put those two things together. And if you don't put those two things together, then what you're going to do is seek your own interests. And this was the concern that God had with Saul. The people were getting him to follow their interests and not the interest of God. Well, what's the difference? Well, obviously there's a big difference, but one of them is God sees the bigger picture, and he knows what ultimately is good all across the board over time, whereas we do not. So we might say something is good in the short term, but we may discover that it's not so good in the long term. You see what I'm saying? So this is a huge issue that is why this obedience is so important. But remember what obedience to the Lord means in New Testament times. It doesn't mean be obedient to the Jewish law, unless, of course, you're Jewish. That's a different story. No, it's obedience to the Christian law, which is love God, love neighbor, which comes right out of the book of Deuteronomy and right out of the book of Exodus as well. But what are we called to do? We're called to love God and love neighbor. Therefore, we act. That's more important. So if you're going to church, which is important, and you're obedient to the Lord, and you're doing everything you're supposed to do, but then some guy comes in, and you go, we don't like those kind of people here. Get out of here. you're not doing what the Lord says. You're being disobedient to the Lord. Kind of a powerful reality there, and something we're looking at. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast, and we are here every single Monday through Friday. And we're here to bring you this message. So remember, we are on your favorite podcast platform. We love your likes, subscribe, pass the word, and we're seeing more and more people listen, and that's good. So we'll be back right after this. As I said, you're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We'll be right back. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. So, as I was saying before the break, we understand this message that what we're called to do is be obedient to God more than anything else. Now, part of that obedience to God, we know means to go to church on Sunday. Well, what does that mean that we can understand that? And I'm not doing that to say, you better be on to church this Sunday. No, I'm not saying it that way. What I'm saying is that, first of all, why do we go to church? We go to church to be nourished by the Lord so that we may do the Lord's work. I always look at that experience of Mass and prayer and everything else as like a time of like sitting around the campfire with God, with Jesus. So I always kind of think of it. That might sound a little hokey, but I do. You know, we hear the word of God and everything. But this is also one of the reasons why I focus on the first reading, because we hear the word of God, but if we don't understand all the backstories, it's always, isn't this interesting? And isn't this something? But we don't know the backstory, and the backstory is very key so that we can understand what's actually being read to us. Well, at the same time, that's so that we may do the Lord's work. And what is our mission? Our mission is to love God and neighbor. We're called to be obedient to the Lord. And when we're not obedient to the Lord, that's what sin is. That's all. But here's one of the things. This is one of the problems with a morality-focused Catholicism. Because the mission is not to live moral lives, it's to live loving lives. And if you live loving lives, you're going to be living moral lives. You know, I mean, really simple. If you love somebody, you're not going to steal from them. That's simple. But you're also going to know how to respond, and you know how to react. And, you know, there's all different ways of living the gospel, but we're called to do that, to live loving lives. But that means that all of us are called to do that, especially the leaders. And the leaders and that means, well, I suppose I'm technically a leader too. We're called to be people of prayer who act on what we're called to do. So if you understand that, and you understand your role as being people of prayer who then act on our prayer, seeking to be obedient to the Father, but what are we doing? We want to be loving God, loving neighbor. But realize our culture, by definition, first of all, one of the things that's central to American culture, it's that whole symbol of Clint Eastwood, which if you've seen how Clint Eastwood really is, he's not really like his characters in the movies. But that Clint Eastwood, the rugged individualist, you understand that's that, you know, especially that character. Let me give you a great example of someone who is considered a hero, at least back in those days, maybe not today, growing up, a hero for being disobedient to the authorities. Dirty Harry. And the Dirty Harry movies. Remember, Go Ahead, Make My Day. My mother used to say that to me. Go ahead, make my day. She used to love those movies. And you do realize, if you do watch the movies, all the characters, when, especially that famous sign, did he, go ahead, make my day, are very one-dimensional characters. They're really not a good portrayal of real people. I mean, that's just the nature of the movie. That's very common in movies, in many movies anyway. But the Dirty Harry movies are that rugged individualist that everyone considers a hero, but not within the concept of God. That's more like Saul. Saul was more like Dirty Harry than anything else. And that's one of the things you want to look at. You want to understand, how is our obedience to the Father? What is our way of acting? How are we called to do? Now, let me give you, because this, obviously working in a hospital ministry, this comes up a lot. But let me give you a good example of that. One of the big discussions is the pandemic. And I'm working 2 hospitals. I'm now required in both hospitals to wear the mask. Especially in one hospital, it's been required since, I think it was January 9th, and the other one since last week. I'm required to wear the mask in one hospital when I go into a patient rooms, and the other one is any time I'm in a clinical area, I'm required to wear the mask. Well, you remember what the mask was when everyone was required to wear the mask. And I had said back then, people are going to look back at this time and say, what were they thinking? And we will. And we're already doing that now. But there was that big fight with the mask. Remember what I said? You're not going to win that battle. You're just not going to. You walk into a store without a mask and say, I refuse to wear a mask, they're going to kick you out of the store and you lost the battle. We had an expression in the Navy: you win the battle, you lose the war. What ultimately are you called to do? And I used to say, wear the mask in obedience to God. Not necessarily obedience to the government, but obedience to God. And when you are doing that, then you have a completely different message. And basically, if you wanted to rebel against wearing the mask in that area, obviously I would never do that. Now, the hospital says wear the mask. I'm going to wear the mask, especially during this time when it is true, the flu is very big. And so, but in any case, we'll say back then I wanted to rebel. Well, I told you, the way I learned to do that is you do exactly what they say to a point, and then you carry it to the extreme, to the point that they beg you not to do it. And that's how it works. So I had said around that time they were doing a recall vote for the governor of California, and people were complaining about the mask, and they were against this and they were against, because you remember one of the silly rules was in California was that if you went out to a restaurant, which was important because that's how people made their money. If, the restaurant owners, if you went out to a restaurant, you had to wear the mask, but you could take the mask down to put food in your mouth and then put the mask back up. So, as I said, if you really wanted to fight against these policies, you wear the mask and say, this is why I'm voting to recall the governor. Use it as a campaign poster. Do you see what I'm saying? Because when you do that, then you take what they say. What? I'm wearing a mask. You take what they say, use it to an extreme until they beg you to stop doing it. That's the way it works. Well, that's Walter Wink's teachings. So when you understand that, but you understand that you fight the right battle, and this is what the Lord is saying. If you're going to fight the right battle, you're going to be obedient to the Lord. And if you decide, well, no, I'm going to do things this way, I know the Lord wants me to do it a different way, that's not going to work. It's just not going to work, because the Lord is saying the obedience is more important than the sacrifice. And understand that. So if you're very faithful to church, you're very faithful to the rules and everything, and then you tell your neighbor get lost when he comes over looking for a cup of sugar, that's not doing what the Lord wants. But you're doing what you think is the right thing. You're doing the sacrifice correctly, but you're not loving God and loving neighbor, which is the actual mandate. So we put all this together and we understand this the way the Lord calls us to understand it, and we keep that message together. So that's an interesting message for democracy. Now, always remember what I was saying before. One of the problems for the past 20 years is this thing called, the book actually called Bowling Alone. And it's rooted in this thing called where people are not paying, they're not getting involved in groups. They're not socializing as much. And in doing so, all they're doing is sending a check to support a movement, but they're not actively involved. And democracy calls for people to be actively involved, all these little groups. I went to a fundraiser last night for a group that seeks to bring more respect to all people, regardless of who they are. And so I said, well, what the heck? And it was, I don't know, I don't think it was affiliated with the Knights of Columbus, but it was at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Whitman, Massachusetts. So I went and I just checked it out, dropped in, said, hello, hi, I'm the local Catholic chaplain. I didn't dress as a priest just because my first time there. This was not a Catholic group. And I said, well, I'll come from that perspective. And so I did. But that's what they want. They want people involved to see, and that's how democracy works. When we come to be involved and we act on what the Lord is calling us to do instead of for our own interests, but for the common good. We'll be right back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and we're going to be talking more about Samuel tomorrow. Obviously, we're going to continue in the book of Samuel for quite some time. But, something I wanted to bring out, if you remember correctly, what Alexander Dugan said when the war in the Middle East started back on October 7th of 2023. If you remember, he said, if you don't understand eschatology, you will not understand that war. And I realize as I follow in what's being told here of 1 Samuel that he was right. And just so you know, he was right. It doesn't mean that eschatology, which is the study of the end times, doesn't mean the end times are coming, but he was right. And that's an important distinction. So he understood what he was saying, which, by the way, our American media, and probably the media around the world, do not. They have no clue. I'm going to tell you that right now. They don't have a clue. And they never do. Maybe about local events when it comes to religion, they don't have a clue. They never have. They never will. And I've always understood it. Maybe during my father's time when he wrote for the Globe, back then it was a prestigious newspaper. I worked for him back then too. But today, no. They don't understand, and Alexander Dugan was right. So we're going to continue more with the book of Samuel, formerly known as the book of Kings, the first book of Kings. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a blessed day. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.